The harbor smelled of salt and diesel that morning, a mix of life and labor clinging to the waterline. Boats rocked gently at their moorings, their ropes creaking against iron bollards as if whispering to one another. Fishermen hauled nets, shouting greetings across the pier, and gulls circled overhead with the sharp insistence of creatures who had learned that human work often meant easy food. Among this living tapestry of sea and sweat, one vessel sat quietly, smaller than the rest but with lines that spoke of careful maintenance. A 30-foot sloop with a white hull, the kind of boat that didn't stand out unless someone truly looked. And leaning against its mast, hands tucked into the pockets of a weathered jacket, stood a woman who most would pass by without more than a glance. Her name was Elena Marlowe, though here on the docks people simply called her Ellie. She kept to herself, the kind of neighbor who nodded but didn't linger, who smiled but never shared much. She seemed simple, almost ordinary, just another soul who had found refuge near the water, living modestly, content with tides and solitude. Her hair was tied back in a plain knot, streaked with early gray though she was only in her early 40s. She wore jeans and boots scuffed from years of use, her posture relaxed but alert, as if she'd spent a lifetime standing watch without anyone noticing. To most, she was just a quiet woman with a boat. But there was a weight in her eyes, the kind of depth that came from having seen too much, though no one ever asked. That morning she was preparing to take the sloop out for a sail. It wasn't luxury for her, not some weekend hobby. The sea was her rhythm, her escape, her way of keeping ghosts at bay. She'd stocked up supplies the night before: water, canned food, a patched sail she'd finished repairing by hand. She worked slowly, methodically, with the precision of someone who knew that mistakes on the water could be fatal. The harbor master waved at her in passing, and she lifted a hand in return, her face giving nothing away. She didn't notice the men at first. They arrived in a black SUV that didn't belong on the dockside, the sort of vehicle that smelled of city streets and power, not salt and rust. 3 of them stepped out, moving with the air of people who thought everything in their sight could be theirs for the taking. They wore civilian clothes, but their posture betrayed them. Straight backs, squared shoulders, eyes scanning the environment like predators. They walked together, not too close, not too far, a loose triangle that covered angles instinctively. Ellie noticed them only when their boots thudded on the wood of the pier, a sound out of place among the easy shuffle of fishermen and sailors. They stopped near her boat, their eyes narrowing as they studied her. The tallest of them, broad-shouldered with a scar cutting across his jaw, nodded once as if confirming something. "Nice vessel," he said, voice carrying a casual authority that wasn't friendly. "Yours?" Ellie looked up, meeting his gaze with an expression as unreadable as the sea before a storm. "Yes," she said simply. The man's smile was thin, practiced. "We'll take it." The words hung in the air like a sudden shift of wind. Around them life went on, nets splashed into water, engines roared to life, but in that small pocket of space the world narrowed to tension. Ellie tilted her head slightly, studying them with quiet curiosity, as if measuring not the threat itself but how far they were willing to push. "I don't think so," she said, her tone calm, almost gentle. The second man, leaner, eyes sharp as broken glass, stepped forward. "Listen, lady, don't make this hard. We need the boat. You hand it over, nobody gets hurt." Ellie's hand brushed against the railing of her sloop, her fingertips tracing the cool metal. To anyone watching, she seemed remarkably calm for someone facing 3 men intent on taking her property. Most people would have shouted for help, or tried to run, or given in quickly to avoid confrontation. But she didn't move, didn't flinch. Her eyes, steady and unblinking, locked onto the scarred man's, and for a brief instant he felt a flicker of discomfort, something in her stillness that didn't fit the picture of an ordinary woman. "Boats aren't given," Ellie said finally. "They're earned. This one isn't for sale, and it isn't for taking." The third man chuckled, his laughter a low growl. "She thinks she's got a choice," he muttered, reaching into his jacket just far enough to show the outline of a pistol grip. The message was clear, and nearby dockworkers, sensing trouble, began to drift away, giving the confrontation a wide berth. Nobody wanted to get involved in something that smelled like danger. Ellie exhaled softly, a long measured breath. For a moment, memories flickered in her mind, dusty roads and far-off countries, nights under foreign stars, the weight of a rifle in her hands, the steady voice of teammates speaking through comms. She had walked away from that life years ago, traded the violence for quiet, the missions for tides. But habits carved deep don't vanish. She saw the angles, the spacing of the men, the weight distribution in their stances. She noted the slight tremor in the lean man's hand, the overconfidence in the scarred leader's posture, the way the third man's eyes kept flicking to passers-by as if worried about witnesses. She could end this 3 different ways, she realized. The knowledge wasn't a boast, it was just there, ingrained, a reflex from years when hesitation meant death. But she didn't want blood on this pier, didn't want chaos spilling into her refuge. She wanted them gone quickly and cleanly. Reaching into her jacket, Ellie moved slowly, deliberately, making sure all 3 men saw her hand. They stiffened, ready for a weapon. Instead, she pulled out a small, battered leather wallet. She flipped it open with a practiced flick, revealing an ID card worn from years of use but still unmistakable. The insignia glinted faintly in the morning light, the emblem of a branch most civilians had only heard about in whispers, letters bold and black declaring her past affiliation. Special Forces. The men froze. The scarred leader leaned closer, eyes narrowing as he read the name, the designation, the clearance stamps. He recognized it immediately, anyone who had brushed against the darker edges of the world did. Special Forces wasn't just military. It was elite, the kind of people sent where others couldn't go, the kind who left no loose ends. He swallowed, the casual arrogance bleeding out of him as fast as it had come. "You've got to be kidding me," the lean man muttered, his voice suddenly lacking conviction. Ellie closed the wallet with a soft snap and tucked it back into her jacket. Her gaze never wavered. "Walk away," she said quietly. Not shouted, not pleaded, just spoken like an order, the kind that carried weight because it came from someone who had lived the authority to give it. The pier was silent for a moment, save for the cries of gulls and the lapping of waves against wood. The 3 men looked at one another, their earlier confidence fractured, replaced by the primal knowledge of danger. They weren't facing a simple woman with a boat anymore. They were facing someone whose past was carved in battlefields they couldn't imagine, someone who carried an entire weight of experience behind her calm eyes. The scarred man's jaw tightened. Pride warred with instinct, but in the end, survival won. He jerked his head toward the SUV. "Let's go." The lean man hesitated, then followed, muttering curses under his breath. The third man, the one who had shown his pistol, lingered the longest, his gaze locked on Ellie as if trying to read the truth of what he'd seen. But eventually he too backed away, retreating step by step before turning and disappearing into the vehicle. The SUV's engine roared to life, tires crunching against gravel as it pulled away from the dock. Only when the black shape vanished into the distance did the hum of normal life slowly return. Fishermen glanced back, whispering to each other, the tension lingering like smoke after a fire. Ellie stood by her boat, expression unchanged, though inside her chest a storm churned. She had wanted a quiet life, away from all of this. But the past had a way of finding her, no matter how far she sailed. And as she tightened the ropes on her sloop, preparing once more to leave the harbor, she couldn't shake the thought that this was only the beginning, that somewhere forces were shifting, and her cover of simplicity had just cracked wide open. That evening, long after the black SUV had vanished down the coastal road and the fishermen had finished packing their nets, Elena Marlowe sat alone on the deck of her sloop with the lantern burning low, its dim light casting ripples across the polished. The ocean stretched out into darkness, waves sighing against the hull as if urging her to leave, to push out into the endless safety of distance. She sipped slowly from a chipped mug of coffee, not because she needed the caffeine. Her body had learned years ago to operate on no sleep, on adrenaline, on sheer discipline, but because the warmth anchored her to the present. Her mind, however, kept circling back to the men, their faces, the arrogance in their posture, the fear that had twisted their expressions when they saw her ID. She hadn't shown that card in years, hadn't needed to, had promised herself she would never again lean on the weight of her old life to keep her safe. But today she had, and that meant something. Someone had pushed hard enough against her quiet existence that she'd had to remind them and herself who she really was. She hated that feeling. She had chosen the sea precisely to escape it, to live without needing to measure angles of attack or catalog weapons at a glance. But it seemed the universe had other plans. What unsettled her more than the confrontation itself was the precision of it. Men like that didn't just wander down a pier looking for a random boat to steal. Their approach had been too practiced, their intent too sharp. They had wanted her vessel specifically, and that meant someone had sent them. The question was who and why. She leaned back against the mast, letting the wood press into her shoulders, and allowed her mind to run through possibilities with the same cold efficiency she had once used in briefing rooms. Smugglers? Maybe, but smuggling crews preferred speedboats, not sail sloops. Local gangs? Unlikely. Their movements were sloppy, impulsive, not tactical. That SUV had screamed of organization, resources, someone with reach. Which left a darker possibility, They weren't trying to take just her boat. They were testing her. Miles away, in a rented villa perched above the coast, the three men who had tried and failed were now standing in silence before their employer. The room was stark, its furniture expensive but minimal, and the man who occupied the leather chair by the window radiated the kind of power that didn't need volume. His name was Victor Havel, though in the underworld he was rarely addressed as anything but Colonel. He had once worn a uniform, served in a foreign army that had collapsed in fire and corruption, but men like him never disappeared. They adapted, carrying their discipline into the shadows, building empires out of contraband, weapons, and silence. His hair was cut brutally short, his eyes pale as Arctic ice, and his reputation stretched across continents. He had seen failure before, but he did not tolerate it. "You came back without the boat," Victor said softly, his accent sharpening each syllable like a blade. His tone was almost gentle, but the three men shifted uneasily, knowing the softness was more dangerous than fury. The scarred man cleared his throat, his voice low. "It's not what we expected, sir. The woman, she's not ordinary." Victor turned his head slowly, pinning him with that glacial gaze. "Explain." "She had credentials," the scarred man said. "Special Forces. USID. We saw it." Silence stretched across the room. The only sound was the faint clink of ice in Victor's untouched glass of vodka. Then, almost imperceptibly, he smiled. "Interesting," he murmured. "Very interesting. You tried to take a boat and instead you uncovered a ghost." The lean man, emboldened, added quickly, "She told us to walk away. Didn't even raise her voice. Just showed the ID and it was enough." Victor leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "Then she knows what she carries. She knows the weight of fear." He stood, moving to the window where the sea glimmered faintly in the distance. "This is no longer about the boat. That vessel may carry something we want, yes, but now the woman herself is of interest. Find out everything. Name, history, connections. If she truly is Special Forces, then she will not be allowed to vanish back into her waves. Not until I know why she is here on my shore." Back on the pier, Ellie's instincts gnawed at her. She could feel the shift in the air, the same invisible change she used to sense before ambushes, the heaviness that warned her danger wasn't finished but only circling back. She gathered her things, charts, radios, supplies, and moved them below deck with swift efficiency. If she needed to leave in the night, she would be ready. But even as she prepared, she knew running wouldn't solve this. Whoever wanted her boat would follow. And now that they had seen her ID, they would be asking questions, the kind that would lead back to her past. That was what terrified her most. Because Elena Marlowe was not supposed to exist anymore, not the way she had been. Officially, she had been buried under classified files, redacted lines, operations so dark that even allies pretended they had never happened. She had walked away with ghosts on her back and blood on her hands, carrying only the promise that she could disappear into anonymity if she stayed quiet. Now anonymity was cracking. She opened a drawer below deck and pulled out a small locked case. The lock was biometric, a relic of her old life, and as her thumb pressed against it, she felt a faint pang of shame. She had sworn never to open it again. But the click of the latch was like an old song returning. Inside lay a pistol, carefully oiled, its serial number long filed away. Beside it, a combat knife, a folded map with coordinates she hadn't looked at in a decade, and a small bundle of photographs, faces of her old team, men and women who had fought beside her in places where survival was measured in seconds. Most of them were gone now, buried in unmarked graves or remembered only in whispers. She stared at the photographs for a long time, her hand trembling just slightly. She had built her life here to honor their memory by living quietly. But maybe quiet was no longer an option. That night, as the coastal town slept, headlights appeared once more on the road above the harbor. Ellie spotted them from her deck, her body tense before her mind even processed it. She doused the lantern and crouched low, watching as another SUV rolled to a stop. This one didn't disgorge three reckless men. It released six, moving with precision, their silhouettes outlined against the sodium glow of the street lamps. These were not amateurs. They swept the pier in formation, rifles cradled casually but ready, eyes scanning. Ellie's heart beat steady, not fast, years of training locking her into calm focus. They were coming not just for her boat now. They were coming for her. And as she slipped the pistol into the waistband of her jeans, she knew the simple woman the town believed her to be was gone. What remained was the soldier she had buried, called back by the inevitability of survival. The question was no longer whether she could keep her boat. It was how far she was willing to go once again to protect the life she had tried so desperately to build. The night was still except for the rhythmic sigh of the tide, the occasional metallic groan of mooring lines as boats shifted in the harbor, and the faint whistle of wind cutting across the dark water, but beneath that quiet there was tension, like a bowstring drawn tight. And Elena Marlowe felt it vibrate through her bones as she crouched in the shadows of her sloop, her eyes locked on the 6 figures fanning out across the pier with the cold precision of men who had drilled in formation, their weapons cradled like extensions of their bodies, their movements silent but deliberate, professional in a way the earlier 3 had not been. These weren't scouts or thugs, these were operators, the kind who didn't knock twice, the kind sent when someone wanted certainty. And Ellie's breath slowed to a controlled rhythm as her body shifted into a state she hadn't lived in for years but hadn't forgotten, her pulse steady, her awareness widening until she felt every detail, the crunch of a boot on wet planks, the glint of metal from a rifle barrel under the lamplight, the faint rasp of a comm in one man's ear that caught and carried across the damp night air. Because once you had lived too long in combat zones, the world never returned to silence, it only waited for you to hear what others couldn't. She knew the harbor well, every piling and ladder, every boat that would creak under weight, every shadow that could swallow a body whole, and she used that knowledge like a second weapon, slipping below deck for a moment and drawing the pistol she had sworn never to touch again, the weight of it both foreign and familiar, her fingers curling around the grip with the muscle memory of years, then slipping a small combat knife into her boot as insurance because guns could jam but steel never. What? Through the porthole she tracked their approach. They were moving in a pincer, 3 spreading left down the pier, 2 flanking to the right along the adjacent dock, and 1 hanging back as overwatch, his posture giving away that he was the comms link, the one relaying their movements to someone not present, someone who was listening and waiting, probably Victor himself. Ellie felt the old calculations snap back into place, angles of engagement, distances, the timing of footsteps, and though a part of her screamed that she could cast off now, start the engine and slip into the night, she knew it wasn't that simple because once they had her marked, once Victor's men had placed her in their sights, running would only postpone the hunt and worse, it would draw fire that could endanger the fishermen who lived off this pier, men who had nothing to do with her past. So the choice was clear, not one she wanted but one she understood. Neutralize, silence, disappear. She slid up silently, the pistol steady in her grip, and moved to the stern where shadows cloaked her, waiting for the first of the 3 to pass within striking distance. His boots thudded softly against the wood, his rifle angled down as he scanned between the rows of boats, his breath misting faintly in the cold air, and when he passed by her stern, Ellie moved like water, one hand snapping up to clamp over his mouth, the other driving the pistol grip into the side of his head with surgical force, dropping him limp without a sound. She dragged him swiftly against the hull, stripping the comm from his ear and tucking the body into the darkness, her motions quick and practiced, her mind detached, compartmentalizing the action so it wouldn't touch the fragile walls she had built over years of pretending she was no longer this person. She clicked the comm on just long enough to catch the hushed chatter, Alpha Team clear Sector 1 proceeding to dockside, and then killed it, pocketing the device. Now she had information and more importantly she knew their call signs, their structure, their discipline, which only confirmed her suspicion that Victor wasn't just using mercenaries. He had ex-military men trained and hardened now in his pay. The other 2 on that side of the pier were closing in, their rifles sweeping in arcs, and Ellie dropped low, rolling beneath the narrow gangplank and pulling herself silently into the shadow under the dock, her body moving with the fluid control of a predator. The wood above creaked faintly as the 2 men passed, their silhouettes sharp against the lamplight. Ellie waited until the second man paused, scanning left, his attention briefly caught by a noise further down the dock, and in that instant she surged up from the side, her knife flashing once, quick and clean across the tendons at the back of his knee, pulling him down silently before catching him in a chokehold, her arm crushing his windpipe until he sagged into unconsciousness. The third spun, sensing movement, but Ellie had already taken the fallen man's suppressed sidearm and fired once, the round whisper quiet as it dropped him before he could shout. She breathed evenly, 3 down, 3 to go, her mind already cataloging their positions, her body shifting with the economy of a veteran who no longer thought about survival but simply executed. Across the pier, the 2 flanking men paused, their comms flickering with static as they tried to raise their fallen teammates, and Ellie heard the slight edge in their voices as unease crept in, that moment when professionals realized the script had gone off course. The overwatch at the rear shifted, his rifle raised, scanning, tension vibrating through his posture, but Ellie was already moving, crouching low between the boats, using the shadows and the lull of the tide to mask her approach. She slipped onto the deck of a neighboring trawler, its nets hanging heavy and its cabin dark, and from there she lined up her borrowed suppressed pistol, squeezing off 2 controlled shots that dropped the flanking pair before they could even locate her. Silence swallowed the pier again, broken only by the sudden hiss of Victor's voice crackling faintly through the comms still in her pocket, a voice filled with irritation rather than fear, asking sharply, "Report. Alpha Team, respond." Ellie didn't answer, didn't give him the satisfaction of knowing who was dismantling his carefully laid plan, and instead slid back into the darkness, leaving the Overwatch alone. The last man was good, she had to give him that. He didn't panic when the others failed to respond. Instead, he shifted position, crouching with his back to cover, scanning with steady precision, his trigger finger light but ready. Ellie could see in his posture that he'd been in the field long enough to know what it meant when comms went dead and teammates disappeared. It meant something or someone far more dangerous than expected was in play. He adjusted his headset, spoke low into it, but before Ellie could hear the full transmission he moved, retreating, not advancing, peeling back toward the SUV, likely under orders to extract and regroup. She considered letting him go, considered allowing him to carry back the message that she was more than they could handle, but then she imagined Victor's cold eyes narrowing, the escalation that would follow, and she decided she couldn't allow that seed of knowledge to be planted. She moved fast, sprinting silently along the pier, her boots barely kissing the wood, and closed the distance just as he reached the edge. He spun, rifle snapping up, but she was already inside his arc, her hand slamming the barrel aside, her elbow driving into his throat with brutal precision. He staggered, gasping, tried to swing back, but she locked her arm around his, twisted, and dropped him hard, her pistol pressing cold against his temple as his breath came ragged. For a moment their eyes met, his wide with disbelief, hers calm and relentless, and she whispered, "Tell your colonel he sent the wrong ghosts." Then she knocked him out clean, dragging his body out of sight like the others, erasing her presence with the efficiency of someone who had done it far too many times. When it was done, the harbor was silent again, the bodies hidden, the waves lapping gently as if nothing had happened at all. Ellie stood on the deck of her sloop, breathing slow, her pistol still warm in her hand, and stared out into the darkness where the SUV had once waited. She knew this was no victory. This was a flare in the night sky, a signal Victor would see for exactly what it was: resistance. And men like him didn't accept resistance. They escalated. Which meant this was only the beginning, the first ripple of a storm that would not stop until it either consumed her or forced her back into the shadows she had spent years escaping. She holstered the pistol, wiped the knife clean, and glanced once at the horizon, the old ache of anticipation settling deep in her bones. She had wanted nothing more than to live simply, quietly, with only the sea for company. But now the sea itself whispered the truth she could no longer deny. Elena Marlowe, the woman, had been seen. What came next would require the soldier. By morning the harbor had returned to its usual rhythms, nets rising heavy with the day's catch, gulls crying overhead, fishermen bellowing greetings as though the night before had been nothing more than another calm evening on the water. But beneath the surface, Elena Marlowe felt the aftershocks of what she had done. 6 men neutralized in silence, their bodies still hidden in places no one would stumble upon until she wanted them found, their weapons stripped and secured in a duffel below deck, their comms wiped clean of evidence, because she knew too well how these games played out. Bodies drew police, police drew questions, and questions drew records, and she could not afford to leave her fingerprints in any file where they might resurface. She worked through the dawn with the same meticulous precision she had lived by in war zones, her motions efficient, never hurried but never lingering, scrubbing blood traces from wood, resecuring the ropes, washing the deck until it looked as though nothing had happened. To anyone who glanced her way, she was just a solitary woman cleaning her boat, her expression calm, her back bent to work, and though her neighbors nodded or called out pleasantries, they noticed nothing unusual. That was the paradox of invisibility she had mastered. The more ordinary you appeared, the less anyone saw. Yet even as she moved through those ordinary gestures, she felt the weight pressing against her chest, not guilt. She had long ago learned how to live with the necessary costs of survival, but the inevitability of escalation. Victor Havel was not a man to shrug off failure. 6 men lost without a whisper meant his pride had been wounded, and men like him healed pride only with blood. And indeed, in the villa perched high on the coastal cliffs, Victor stood at the head of a long wooden table, his hands pressed flat against its polished surface as his lieutenants gathered in tense silence. The night's losses had not gone unnoticed. Each man in that room had served under him long enough to know what such failure meant, and none dared to speak first. The colonel's pale eyes flicked across them, measuring, slicing, until finally he spoke, his voice soft, almost casual, which made it all the more terrifying. 6 men, he said. Gone. Not captured. Not wounded. Gone. Silenced as if they were children stumbling in the dark. And do you know what that tells me? He didn't wait for an answer. He straightened, the ghost of a smile playing at his lips. It tells me we are not dealing with a simple woman guarding a boat. We are dealing with training. With precision. With someone who has walked in the same shadows we have. He poured himself a measure of vodka, the sound of liquid hitting glass loud in the stillness, then continued. She carries an ID, Special Forces. Perhaps some relic she carries for protection. Perhaps not. But I want to know. I want her name, her past, her weaknesses. And most importantly, I want her alive. Do you understand? Alive. His men nodded, though unease flickered in their eyes. Bringing someone alive was always harder, and they all understood what it meant if the colonel wanted answers instead of corpses. Send word down the coast, Victor finished. Every contact, every dockhand, every informant. The woman has shown her teeth. Now we will see how long she can bite. Ellie felt the pressure within hours. By mid-morning, strangers appeared along the pier. Faces that didn't belong, men pretending to be tourists with cameras slung around their necks but whose shoes were military-grade, whose eyes scanned with the wrong rhythm, looking not at scenery but at angles of approach. The harbor master, a kind man who had known her only as Ellie with the little boat, approached nervously to warn her that questions were being asked about her vessel, about her habits, about whether she took crew aboard or sailed alone. He didn't pry, but his unease was clear, and she thanked him with the calm smile she had perfected, then retreated back to her sloop to think. Options unrolled in her mind like tactical maps. She could vanish now, sail at dusk and lose herself in the vastness of the sea, where no one could follow without trackers or satellites. But Victor was not the kind of man to give up once his prey fled. If she disappeared, he would widen the hunt, draw in local authorities under bribery, use fishermen as unwilling eyes, and soon the entire coast would whisper of the ghost woman with a boat, and that meant more exposure, more chances for her past to surface. She could confront him directly, cut off the head of the serpent, but charging into his villa would be suicide without intelligence, without knowing how deep his resources went. No, she realized the only path forward was somewhere between, to gather her own information, to strike quietly where it hurt, to remind him that he was not the only one who could run a shadow war. She began preparing the boat not for flight but for battle. Hidden compartments she had built into the sloop years ago, remnants of a mind that had never fully believed in peace, were opened and checked. In one, a waterproof case held encrypted radios, tools for listening and jamming. In another, false bottom crates carried rations and water filters enough for weeks at sea. Her sails were reinforced with carbon weave, her engine tuned for bursts of speed, all done under the guise of hobby repairs over the years. To her neighbors she was simply a woman who loved tinkering with her vessel. To her, it had been insurance, a quiet preparation for a day she had prayed would never come. That day had arrived. As dusk painted the horizon in streaks of orange and violet, Ellie sat cross-legged in the cabin with a map spread before her, her knife tapping lightly on the wood as she thought. Victor's network stretched wide, but networks had cracks and she knew how to find them. Men like him relied on loyalty purchased, not earned, and purchased loyalty was fragile, easily broken with the right pressure. If she could find one link, one weak link, she could unravel more. Her gaze fixed on a small inlet 2 harbors down, a place she remembered from whispers among fishermen. A warehouse where shipments changed hands quietly, where Victor's men stored contraband before moving it inland. That was a place she could strike, a place she could send a message of her own. Not one of surrender but of warning. Meanwhile, Victor's patience was thinning. Reports filtered in from the coast. Fishermen intimidated into silence, harbor workers questioned, local police bribed into looking the other way, and still no progress. He pored over surveillance photos, grainy shots of Ellie on her boat, blending among sailors, her posture unremarkable, her expression unreadable. Yet the longer he studied her, the more convinced he became that this was no coincidence. The boat, the location, her silence, it was all too deliberate. He summoned one of his oldest lieutenants, a man named Carell, scarred and weathered but loyal, and gave him direct orders. Bring me the woman. Use whatever you must but do not kill her. She has answers and I intend to take them from her mouth. Carell bowed his head, but Victor saw the flicker of unease in his eyes too, the shadow of fear born not of Victor but of the unknown woman who had erased 6 men in the dark without a sound. That night, Ellie moved like a shadow herself, leaving the harbor under cover of darkness, her sloop's sails trimmed low, engine throttled to a whisper, slipping down the coast toward the inlet she had marked. She wore black, her hair tucked beneath a cap, her pistol and knife close at hand. The sea around her was calm, moonlight glinting off gentle swells, but her mind was sharp, focused. Every nerve in her body thrummed with the anticipation of violence, not because she sought it but because she had accepted it. This was no longer about a boat. It was about survival, about reclaiming control from a man who thought he could drag her past into the light and use it as a weapon. She would not allow it. Not again. As she drew near the inlet, the faint glow of floodlights appeared on the shoreline, illuminating the corrugated shell of the warehouse. Trucks were parked outside, men moving with the lax confidence of those who believe themselves secure. Ellie cut the engine, letting the sloop drift into silence, and slipped into the water with a swimmer's grace, the cold biting into her skin but sharpening her senses. She moved through the black waves like a knife, emerging near the dock where shadows clung deepest, pulling herself up without a sound. From here she could see the operation clearly, crates stacked high, guards smoking at the corners, rifles slung carelessly, their discipline far weaker than the team Victor had sent for her. She studied them, counted their rotations, measured the timing between their glances. This was her advantage. She had lived in places where mistakes meant death, and here, among men who thought themselves safe, mistakes were everywhere. She could use every one that the storm had passed, but the marina was not yet calm. The night air still smelled of salt and wet wood, the docks creaked with the weight of water still dripping from their soaked planks, and the air carried the faint static charge that lingers after lightning has ripped apart the sky. Sarah's boat rocked gently in its berth, lines pulled tight, every knot double-checked by her own steady hands. She had secured it not just against the storm but against the men who had tried to take it earlier, the predators who thought she was nothing more than a simple woman. They hadn't yet realized who they were dealing with, but she knew the truth. That night had only been the opening move in a game that was far from over. She poured herself a mug of black coffee, her eyes restless, scanning the horizon. Dawn was still a couple of hours away, a faint glow on the edge of the world, but her body was wired with a soldier's alertness. She couldn't sleep, her instincts told her they'd be back. Not the same three men, perhaps. They were likely licking their wounds, furious that their plan had been upended, but whoever they worked for. Boats like hers weren't taken on a whim. They had value, speed, durability, and the capacity to carry heavy loads across borders unnoticed. Smugglers, traffickers, mercenaries, Sarah had seen all of them during her deployments, and she knew the look in those men's eyes. They weren't freelancers, they were foot soldiers. Which meant someone else had given the order and someone else would be expecting results. The marina was never entirely empty, even in the small hours of morning. A few liveaboards shuffled on deck, checking lines, smoking cigarettes, pretending not to notice the strange woman on the end slip with her coffee and her sharp, unblinking gaze. She didn't bother with conversation. She didn't need friends here, not yet. She needed information. So she stayed quiet, watched and waited, listening to the language of the docks. The subtle changes in movement, the way shadows shifted, the unnatural silence when trouble was near. By 4:30 she caught it, the low growl of an engine cutting power too early, the sound of a boat drifting rather than approaching under its own steady drive. She set down her mug, all senses sharpened. Through the mist, a shape appeared, just beyond the breakwater, a dark vessel, its running lights off, its wake unnaturally controlled. Sarah didn't move to meet it. Instead, she slid into action the way she had countless times before. Quietly, efficiently, invisible until she chose otherwise. She went below deck, opened the weatherproof case she hadn't touched in years, and pulled out the tools of a different life. The SIG Sauer pistol lay there, well-oiled despite the dust of disuse, along with a collapsible carbine night vision monocular, and the laminated card no one could mistake, her Special Forces identification. Sarah slipped the pistol into a holster beneath her jacket, the night vision into her pocket, and took the ID in her hand. It wasn't a weapon, not in the physical sense, but it had stopped wars before. It was a shield, a reminder of the blood, sweat, and sacrifice that came with it. If these men had any sense at all, it would stop them cold. If they didn't, well then steel and lead would. The boat ghosted closer, finally easing into view. It was larger than most vessels in the marina, black-painted, with a high bow that gave it the look of a predator. Four figures moved aboard, armed, their posture unmistakable. These weren't amateurs. Sarah exhaled slowly, steadying herself. She had dealt with far worse. She stepped onto her deck, her silhouette clear under the dock lights, her stance casual but ready. "Morning," she called, her voice calm, even bored. Early for fishing, don't you think? The men didn't answer. They brought their boat alongside hers, fenders squeaking as they pressed close. One of them, clearly the leader, climbed onto the dock with practiced ease. He was big, heavy-set, but carried himself like someone used to giving orders. He smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Ma'am," he said, his accent faintly Eastern European, "you have something we need. Your boat." Sarah tilted her head as though considering it. "Is that so?" "Yes," the man said. "You will give it to us. Or things become difficult." The others began to move, one stepping onto her deck, another keeping watch from their own boat, weapons just out of sight but ready. Sarah let them. She didn't flinch, didn't step back. Instead, she reached into her jacket slowly, deliberately, and held up the laminated card between two fingers. The Marina's sodium lights gleamed off the seal, the lettering, the unmistakable insignia. "Before you finish that sentence," Sarah said, her voice flat, her eyes like iron, "you should understand exactly who I am." The leader's smile faltered. He squinted at the card, then glanced at her face. Recognition flickered, not of her personally but of the symbol she carried. The Special Forces crest wasn't something you bluffed with. It wasn't something you forged easily. It meant she was dangerous in ways he couldn't measure. It meant there was a file somewhere with her name on it, and that file was classified and thick with redactions. "You think this scares me?" he said, but his voice had lost its confidence. His men shifted uneasily, their body language betraying doubt. Sarah stepped closer, so close he could see the burnished edges of the ID, the wear on the laminate from years of use. "It should," she said softly. "Because if you lay one hand on this boat, you won't just be fighting me. You'll be fighting an entire network of people who don't officially exist. And trust me, when we fight, we don't lose." Silence stretched across the dock. The men glanced at each other, caught between pride and survival, between orders given and the instinct to walk away while they still could. Sarah didn't move, didn't blink. She let the weight of her words hang in the air, backed by the cold, hard truth of her presence. Finally, the leader exhaled, long and slow. He stepped back, raising his hands slightly. "Perhaps another boat will do," he muttered. He signaled to his men, and they began to retreat, the tension snapping as they withdrew to their vessel. Within moments, the Predator boat slipped back into the mist, leaving only ripples in the water and the echo of footsteps fading down the dock. Sarah stood there a long moment, the ID still in her hand, her heart steady, her breathing calm. She had won this round, but she knew it was only a reprieve. Whoever was behind this operation wouldn't stop so easily. They had tested her and she had pushed back. The next time they would come with more firepower, more men and fewer doubts. She went back below deck, locked away her weapons and sat at the table with her coffee, now cold. Her hands wrapped around the mug, but her mind was far from the Marina. She was already running scenarios, thinking like the operator she had once been. Defensive positions, fallback plans, allies she could call if it came to that. She hadn't wanted this fight, but now that it was here, she would not shy from it. The sea outside whispered its endless rhythm, the waves lapping against the hull, steady, eternal. Sarah closed her eyes for a brief moment, feeling the pull of the ocean and the weight of her past. They had tried to take her boat. They had tried to underestimate her. And now they knew she was no simple woman. She was something far more dangerous. And this battle had only just begun. The police boats eventually arrived with their flashing lights, the hum of their engines cutting through the stillness that followed the chaos. But by then, the men who had tried to take her boat were already either in handcuffs, knocked unconscious, or trembling with the shock of who they had just crossed. Mara stood tall at the dock, her jacket zipped against the salty wind, her Special Forces ID still displayed in her hand like a brand of authority that none could ignore. The harbor, usually loud with gossip and fishermen shouting about their catch, was silent, eyes drawn to her like iron filings to a magnet. No one had expected the woman they mocked as a simple boat owner to stand unshaken against violence. As the officers moved to secure the prisoners, one of them, a captain she recognized faintly, approached her with a solemn nod. His eyes shifted from the unconscious man slumped near the railing to her ID, and then back to her face. "You should have called us sooner," he said quietly, though it was more observation than rebuke. Mara's gaze didn't waver. "If I had waited for you," she replied, "the boat would already be gone." That single statement carried weight, a blunt truth no one could argue with. The captain nodded again, understanding not just her words but the steel beneath them. The men who had thought they could muscle her out of ownership were dragged one by one into custody. Some spat curses under their breath, some kept their eyes down, but none dared look at her for long. It wasn't just the ID, it was the way she held herself, the precision in her stance, the calm after the storm of violence that unsettled them. She wasn't just a woman who had once served, she was still every bit the soldier, and in their defeat, they realized they had underestimated not only her but the quiet power she carried. Onlookers whispered at the edges of the docks, neighbors who had dismissed her as plain or ordinary, people who had never bothered to see beyond her solitude. Now they saw her as something different, someone who had lived a life few of them could imagine. As the last of the men were hauled away, a strange stillness lingered, like the hush after a storm. Mara turned away from the crowd, not seeking their admiration or their fear. She didn't care what they thought of her. She only cared that her boat, her sanctuary, her last tie to freedom, remained hers. When the police asked her to come to the station to give a statement, Mara complied without protest. She followed in her truck, leaving the boat secured at its berth with extra chains, knowing now that people's greed would not stop simply because she had scared off one group. At the station, fluorescent lights buzzed above her, and officers typed away at their desks. The captain who had spoken with her earlier guided her to a small interview room, offering her water before settling in across from her. His questions were direct but not hostile. How had she known they were coming? Why had she acted alone? Did she realize the risk she had taken? Mara answered with the same precision she always did, calm, clipped, each word a fact stripped of emotion. She told them how the threats had escalated, how the men had moved from intimidation to outright attempts to seize her boat, and how,